Welcome and thank you for being here. Please tell me if I speak too quickly or too softly. I have a tendency to do both. I am loving my time here. I got to go over to Finland and down to Latvia, and it's just, you live in a wonderful place. I am just really loving it. So thank you. Thank you all for having the animal movement that you have here and for all being part of it. It's a wonderful thing to see. So let me begin by saying that I sometimes use the word animal, and the reason I use it is because it avoids othering. So I don't like to talk about animals as if I'm not an animal, because I am, and too often in English we use animal to exclude humanity and talk about other living beings, and it's not the right thing to do. It's a way of distancing ourselves, and it's part of the problem, and you'll kind of see why as I move through the talk. What animal does is it allows us not to have a dualistic, divisive, non-othering. And I can say the word animal, and what it means is any species other than the one that's speaking. So literally any living being could use the word animal and talk about every other species. So it's not exclusive to humanity. And we have other beings like parrot Alex, who have learned to use human language, amazingly enough, which is more than we seem to be able to do for other species. And of course, the signing of other primates. They could use this term and talk about every species except their own. I want to talk a little bit about how I got into ecofeminism. And I want to be very clear that I didn't get any of it in my education. I had a very white male education, and all of this part of philosophy was ignored. So my first books settled with very much a white male ethics, and I also focused on religions. And it was only with time that I started to write more about a female focus. And this happened because of my wonderful older sister who said, why don't you collect some voices of women? The movement is almost all women, so why don't you start doing some of that? That's a great idea. So I started doing an anthology that collected the voices of women. And that's literally all it was initially going to be. But really it was in that process that I started to recognize my Caucasianness, the limitedness of my own vision of the movement, and just how much the women's voices had been marginalized and some of the sexism that's in the movement. And I started to take a look at ecofeminism and see more connections between different types of oppression. So really it was through my writing on behalf of animals that I started to enlarge and get a broader vision of the movement. And as I moved along, I started to connect the environment. And the reason I did this is, especially where I live in Montana, people really don't care about cows and chickens. And so I had to find other ways to try to bring change. And there are a fair number of environmentalists. So what I did was I started to learn more about the environment, more about how our diet affects the world we live in, especially climate change and fresh water depletion, because those are such big and important issues. And when I focused on, I did a book on bears and a book on primates, but they're also very much environmental and they're also very much vegan. But it's a way of drawing in people who have specific interests in a specific type of an animal and trying to get them to have a broader vision of the movement and of the change, the sort of changes that we have to have. So my way to understand ecofeminism has been a very winding path. There's been a lot of growth involved. And I will say personal growth involved. And I will say that this is a somewhat typical thing in ecofeminism. This is very much a part of the ecofeminist tradition, that we have our trajectory and our own personal story. And that's very important to our understanding of the world. And starting to, and I have a personal experience where I understand why that's important. Seeing myself as a Caucasian person in the United States, a wealthy, privileged person in a very wealthy, privileged nation, and yet also a female, and in that way I'm able to relate more to the oppression of animals. Ecofeminism is a theory. It's a theory in the same way that there's a theory of gravity. Right? We throw up a pencil and it falls down to the ground, and then we develop a theory to explain why the pencil falls to the ground. So it's a theory that helps us understand lived oppressions. And in the 70s, this theory was developed. The word came up in France. But remember that it's varied and homogenous, especially feminists tend to be very open to different points of view, and it's new and developing. It hasn't been around very long. So I want to kind of pull a strand of ecofeminism that I think is really helpful to people who work with animals in the animal movement. I think it's very helpful for us to see the bigger picture of the type of activism that we do. So what ecofeminism is basically, it's a way of connecting oppressions. And what the ecofeminists did is they said that there's a connection between the degradation of the environment and the oppression of women. I want to look at a worldview that we tend to have in the Western world. And I want to look at that more closely through language, and I want to use some examples of parallel oppressions to help you see what the ecofeminists have seen and what they've written about. Our worldview is one of false value dualisms, and this is a particularly important concept. So when we look at dualisms, this is what they look like. So you have, on the one hand, and on the other hand, two ideas that in our minds we view as opposites, right? So we have man and woman. We have human and animal. We have civilization and wildness or nature. Right? So this is our vision of the world. The trouble is, of course, it's false, right? There aren't just men and women. There's a whole rainbow of different types of genotypes, different beings born, and to pretend like there's only just clearly males and clearly females is incorrect. To juxtapose human against all the rest of the species is wrong. We're animals. We're part of the world of animals. We're also part of nature, right? How can we be anything else as animals? Of course we're part of nature. So when you start to recognize that these are false, that it's a way of looking at the world that causes problems, you can start to see something very deep and very old that has shaped our understanding of the world. In the Carolinas, there was a child born about a decade ago who suffered under the weight of our idea of dualisms. So this child was born with an ambiguous and not a clear sexuality. So, right away everybody panicked because this is clearly, if you have this vision of male and female and there can be nothing between, this can be very problematic. So basically the parents didn't want the kid, the baby ended up in an orphanage, and before the baby could be adopted, they decided they had to decide what this child was and do an operation because you can't have any ambiguousness. There is male and female, there is nothing else. So they did an operation, the child was adopted, and they decided that, if you don't have a clear maleness in a patriarchal world, then you have to be female. And that's the catch. That's the not male. So the child was determined to be not male. The operation was done, and 6 years later, the child started saying, "When is my penis going to grow?" He was very clear on who he was. He knew he was a male, right? So this idea that there are only two sexes and this insistence on it, you just think what that's done to his life. Think of that damage and that pain and how his life is going to unfold differently because we couldn't accept that there isn't this dichotomy, that the world is richer and deeper and more interesting than that. So on the right-hand side, where we have the dualistic division, we also end up having a hierarchy and value system. So those things on the A side are preferred and valued over those things on the B side. Therefore, the things on the B side end up being oppressed, and they also end up being interconnected. And I'll give you lots of examples of that. But you can then see, when you look at the not A side, how all of these problems, these isms, come out of that not A side. Here's another diagram that kind of helps to see how if you're not A, then you're not a male, and if you're not a male, you're going to be seen as not being rational, right? Not being a person of spirit. If you look at the Western tradition, men had to be the priests. They were the people of God, and the women had to go to the men to understand God because they were more of civilization, more of nature. They were more emotional, and therefore needed to be controlled and schooled under the power of a man. Right? So you can see how as you go around the circle, you can see the different things from the not A side piling up as parts of the oppression of those things on the not A side. as they are disvalued in the hierarchy that is created in our minds. Here also you can see how being female is connected with all of the things on the right-hand side. Now this isn't unfamiliar, right? We know that women are assumed to be irrational, right? That they're closer to nature. That's why we have this idea of Mother Nature, the feminine and the natural world. And then if you look at the animal, you can also see how similar are the ideas of what it is to be an animal. They're irrational, they're uncivilized, and this of course affects how they're treated in our world. Now if you're a person of color and a female, you're going to fall somewhere between the Caucasian female and the animals. So you can see in this very offensive advertisement that the person of color who is a female is being put out in the wilds with the animals, in this case, a leopard. Panther? Thank you. All right, so she's running as if she were part of the, I'll call it pride. And notice that she's dressed like one of them, right? She's got on the skin. So you can see how here, the conflation, the putting together the two ideas, the wildness, the uncivilizedness, is enhanced as you multiply the not a aspect. So if you're female and a person of color, you are disvalued more than if you're just a female. And if you're an animal, you're also disvalued yet more. And a female animal, even more so. So here are some more examples of how you can see racism, sexism, and speciesism all on the same page, one just as ugly as the other. So here you can see the very word, the feline. Notice the feline imagery, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So, right, you can see here there's an uncivilized, wild presentation. And we will come back to this idea because men are such animals, tigers. I'll come back to that in a moment. For now, just noticing the connection between speciesism, sexism, and racism. The connection between the things on the not a side is deep, and the more you look, the more you start to recognize how the isms are interlinked. If we look at capitalism, it's one of the best ways to really explore this deeply. So with capitalism, so the males are the white males own the property. And so they own the means of production and they use it for profit. Now on the not-A side, you're going to have the things used for production and profit. So females fall into the category of something you can use for production, right? So if you're a state, you want boots on the ground. You want soldiers. Who's going to create the soldiers? The women. Their bodies are going to be envisioned as something to be controlled by the state for the state's purposes. The church is going to see it similarly. Control that womb. We need butts in the pews. We warm butts because that's how we get money in the church and that's how the church stays supported. If we don't have another generation of churchgoers, the church isn't going to survive. So you can see how the female anatomy is viewed by the state as something to be used and controlled for production and reproduction, and in this case, to create warm bodies, which is also, I mean, in my country, we blatantly call humans consumers, as if that's all we were. So it's also linked into capitalism. This shows us why, as women age, they become disvalued, right? So once you're done producing, you become invisible, ignored, less important. It also shows us why, if you're a disabled person, if you're a person who can't produce as much wealth, you're going to be disvalued as well. So you start to see through capitalism how you move around the circle to what can produce and reproduce and bring profits to those in power who own the wealth. And if you can't do that, right, so if you're a cow who has been exploited for calves 6 times, you're spent and you're done and you're out. And it's not that different than a woman or a person who is differently abled and can't produce in the same way. And similarly, if you don't fit the heterosexual model, you are not going to be producing in the way that the state or the church envisions. So production and reproduction through capitalism is another really good way to see how the not A side is disvalued and why. Another really good division of the not A side is through the environment. So nature's on the right-hand side, it's the not A side. But along with nature are, of course, classism, people who are poorer, the animals, women. And with the environment, you see the connections between the oppression of all of those groups. So nature, dairy is one of the most environmentally damaging industries that's out there. And not surprisingly, of course, it's closer linked to sexism as well. When we look at the degradation of nature, you can see how not only in the destruction of nature do we destroy the trees and the water, but in doing so you destroy the habitat. So the very homes of the animals, the beings on the right-hand side, they lose their homes and they lose their lives. So in not caring about nature, we also disvalue and harm animals. Jobs that come through destroying nature oppress and harm the poorer people. I know in the United States, if you walk into a slaughterhouse, you will find people who often can't speak English. They aren't able to defend themselves. They will not have medical care. So when we buy food, when we buy flesh, we are supporting an industry that oppresses the poorest and the most marginalized citizens. So again, you can see how the slaughterhouses, which are very destructive to the environment, and of course that hurts all of the people on the I side as much, but also through the very labor, it harms them more. It destroys our health, and again, we know very clearly in the United States that the ones with the worst health are the ones buying the cheapest food. What's the cheapest food? It's the least healthy food. Why is it the least healthy? Because the government subsidizes it. So again, you can see the links between the consumption of animal products, the destruction of the environment, and the harm of poorer people. And of course, the animals themselves on the right-hand side, they are blatantly harmed in the process of the animal industries. So all of the different isms are connected really well if you look at the environment and the harm that's done. You can really see how by putting nature on that right-hand side and by degrading nature, we have really enhanced our harm to the other marginalized categories. One other thing that I want to mention is that when you harm the environment, you harm women and children more than you harm men, especially, of course, males of power. They can always find a way pretty much to protect themselves. But for example, in countries where the forests have been cut down or where the fresh water has been depleted, it is the women who are in charge of bringing firewood. It's the women who are in charge of collecting water. So many girls have to drop out of school to walk 5 hours to bring back the water for the family. So their education is lost because fresh water has been reduced in their area. So it's just one example. And of course, wood collecting is the same. As the forests move back, the girls have less of a chance of spending any time in school because they're spending their time bringing firewood. So the damaging of the environment harms everybody on that not side, and is a really good example of that interconnected oppression. Language is also a really good way to look at the interconnected oppressions. And I want to look at the language of nature first. I'll look a little bit at hunting language and how it objectifies and gives instrumental value to individual beings. So we have the word Mother Nature, as I mentioned, and if you look at in English, the imagery of nature, it's very feminized, and it's also very violent. So you have virgin forests, and you have people plowing the fields, and this is a euphemism for sex, plowing the fields, or deflowering, and the harvest, of course, and we talk about harvesting when we're killing animals as well. So the violence that comes with our understanding of those on the not A side as feminized. I put this image up because I'm frustrated by young people using the F word all the time instead of finding other English words to use. There are other English words, I remind my students, and they look at me like they're not quite sure. But I want to remind you that there are other words, and the reason we want to use those other words is because this is another way of being violent towards women. And right, it shouldn't surprise us that a patriarchal society, when they want to use the worst word they possibly can, it's going to be something that is a violence against women, right? Do you see how that's violence against women, the F word? This is not an act that women do, this is an act that men do. Men are the actors, and it's against women. So why do we want to reinforce this idea of violence and domination of women? I think we don't. At the bottom of that last list was the word husbandry, and this is a word that is defined, as I show here, as a way of controlling animals. And husbandry, it can be done for forests, it can be done for wildlife, and it can be done for farmed animals. What this word shows us is the connection between the control of women and manipulation for the purposes of men, and the control and manipulation of nature for the purposes of men. Slang words also give us a window into linked oppressions. Animal words that are used for females are far more frequent than those used for males, and they are far more derogatory. Notice the cat category, as I pointed out, it's frequently used for females. I don't think there are any cat words for men. Here's the word bitch, which I've used in my title. Notice the category here is canines. In the English language, we can call men dogs. It's a derogatory way to talk about men, but it is nothing like calling them, it isn't a demeaning word. It's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod. Oh, dog, you. Like, you're living the wildlife and you're ignoring morals, and you know it's okay. So when we use these terms for males, think of stud, right? The male horse. You can call a man a stud. And it's a very positive statement. When you look at the farmed animals here, for females, there is a lot of them. You can talk about the old person or the young person. Both of them are males. And notice this image here of the sexualized female ready to be consumed on the sign. And of course, the racialized, animalized tigress here over here in the cat category. And again, here's that positive, because men are such animals, right? But it's women who are being put in the animal category and denigrated, while when this is applied to males, right, it's a positive statement. It shows their strength, their independence, their unpredictability. It's a very positive image for males. When I type in the word bitch, I get images like this, and I'll get a whole lot of them before I will see what the word originally meant, which is a female dog. So you can see how the language has been transformed. And I also wanted to juxtapose the image of the women against the image of the cows. This is what's called a rape rack in the dairy industry, where the dairy cattle are forcibly impregnated so that they will have calves, so that they will lactate. You don't give milk unless you have a baby. So you can see the shared image, and we'll see another rear entry image later on. Talking a little bit about hunting. Hunting is a very interesting phenomenon, obviously a very male-dominated practice, but in some ways shifting, especially in the United States. Notice that the words that in English that we use to demean and objectify animals like dumb beasts, we make them out to be these dangerous, savage, because, right, if the big man hunter goes out with his gun and shoots the small deer that is frightened and really would have just won, it's just not very impressive. So you have to make it out to be something that you have to be really cool, strong, brave. You have to make it into a manly activity. One way that this is done is through language that demeans and objectifies, makes it look right to kill these animals, like they deserve it, like there's something equal going on here, and our language is one of the ways that we do that. This is extremely revealing, the sexual language in English of hunting. So when I ask people why they go hunting, one of the biggest excuses is that they want intimacy with nature. So intimacy, of course, is also a word for something that one does with another human being that has a sexual element. But I always say, if you really want to be intimate with nature, why don't you plant a garden? You'll be out there every day digging the dirt, you can pull weeds, you can sit out there, you can bond with your whole family. The other thing I say is, really, if it's about intimacy with nature, how come you're only out there for one day? You go out there with your gun and you want to kill something, and you're not happy out there unless you're killing something or have a gun or intend to kill something. So it's clearly not true that they're interested in intimacy with nature. It is an excuse for males to go out with beer and guns and hang out in the woods. but you can do that without killing things. The rest of the imagery here really shows what it's about, right? So guns are phallic. They have that long, and something shoots out the end. You have bullets, which are called balls. The slang for bullets is balls, which means testicles as well in English. You have firing, which is called discharge, the same word that's used for ejaculation. And when you shoot too soon, the same word as when the man ejaculates too soon, so you have premature discharge. When you actually hit your target, it's called penetration. Again, the same word used in sex. And when I had another teacher arranged a debate with myself and a student who was a hunter to in front of students talk about it. And I said, so what is it really you like about killing? And it's the one time a man's ever been blatantly honest. He said, it's an orgasmic experience. Another vision we can have through words of hunting is that it's in many ways, it's militarized. And again, it has to do with that manliness and that maleness. And if you're living in the suburbs somewhere outside of Austin, Texas, and you want to feel really cool, you want to feel like a man. In my culture, you have to have a gun and you have to kill something, apparently, because this is some of the imagery. One way you can do that is to go out in the woods and find an animal, somebody that is defenseless and doesn't have a gun. But you have this image, right? Look at these people. I mean, look at these gadgets. Look at this. I think this is a bow, I'm guessing. It is. The arrows and the bow. So this is $1 million bow, and a bunch of people that look like they're going out to war, and they're killing some bear that only wanted to be left alone. And brown bears will run away as fast as they can if they know you're coming. So they, the violence that's involved here and the language that shows that male image of wilderness as dangerous and to be conquered and controlled. And it's all linked to this idea of management that government does. That government steps in and manages the wildlife. And it doesn't manage for its own sake. And it's not managed for ecosystems. It's managed for hunters. It's manipulated for hunters. It's not managed, it's manipulated. Of course, there's a problem in that nowadays hunting is dropping off, so they're recruiting little girls to hunt. So the manly image is somewhat damaged by the reality of hunting, which is that almost anyone can kill the wildlife. It certainly isn't hard. Notice this sexualized pose here. She's all about who's looking at her. So that idea still carries over into hunting. But we can see in the words here the deceit that goes on to try to maintain this idea of hunting as manly. So you have ideas like fair chase. There's nothing fair about it, right? The animal isn't armed. The animal doesn't know what's going on. The animal's just trying to survive. They're out eating, they're just doing things that they do, and somebody sneaks up on them and kills them. And there's certainly no chase, because as soon as they run, it's over. You can't kill them. So you look at the deceit. Neither of those words is true. Our refuges, what we call a wildlife refuge, it's really just a way of breeding animals for hunting. It's not a refuge. They're not safe there. A refuge means safety. So again, it's dishonest. We talk about the compassion of killing the animals before the winter comes so they won't starve. But the manipulation of wildlife makes sure that there's an excess so that hunters can kill them. So you can't build an excess to be hunted and then claim that you're helping them by killing them. I mean, it's dishonest. And of course, claiming that they're environmentalists when we're manipulating species and changing ecosystems is again dishonest. So I thought, bollocks, which means full testicles and nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, and I came up with some words that better fit what hunting actually is. And if you look at these definitions, you'll see that if we were honest, we would use these to talk about hunting rather than something like fair chase, which is clearly dishonest. Language, the point of language is to objectify and turn another living being into something that has instrumental value. So if you look at words like livestock, so stock is something that sits on a shelf to be purchased. So animals are envisioned, farmed animals are envisioned as living stock. They're also called things like beef and pork. They're being called what we eat. So instead of recognizing them as individuals, we talk about their flesh or their cuts. And of course, we remove the S so that you're not eating chickens, which you're really eating. Instead, you're eating chicken or fish instead of fishes and chickens, which gives them identity, individuality. We do the same thing in our patriarchal culture. I know that when my mother married my father, whose name is Walter, she became Mrs. Walter Kemmerer. So she literally disappeared behind her husband. She becomes a wife and a housewife and a mother, and she loses her equal identity as an individual. So you can see how language helps to marginalize those on the right-hand side. So looking quickly at a few examples here to help us see very visually, very graphically, the conflating of ideas on the not a side. Here we have the feminized chicken for consumption. You can see the eye, the posture of the head. Chickens don't. This isn't how chickens move, right? This is a female being. This is a woman. This is a woman position. This is the rear entry position. For all practical purposes, this is a sexualized woman looking like a chicken, right? And you have the same thing here, the line of the leg. So you can see what this is saying is it's for consumption. This one is particularly offensive to me because it's about women's skin, right? Healthy skin, less scratches and cellulitis. So what they're saying is, women, if you want to have a beautiful leg for consumption, you use my product and you'll be like this chicken, all ready for someone to take a nice juicy bite of your leg. This one is horribly offensive. The turkey hooker. It shows how the opening that is the vagina in a chicken is called a turkey, or birds is called a coacula. So from pan to platter, right? Scoop it up and move it. Easy pickup. Pickup is a word for like a prostitute. Do a pickup. And look at how sexualized this turkey is. So you can see how the consumable woman, ready for the man's eye, the consumable bird, ready for the human mouth. I am flesh for you, eat me. Whether you're a woman or a chicken, it's all about the men on the A side. So those on the not A side are objectified, they are sexualized, they are given instrumental value to such an extent that an image like this can appear on a magazine like Hustle and it's acceptable. That this woman is literally being ground up for flesh and for consumption by the dominant males. So in closing, I just want to say that as a woman, I have gotten more in touch with my past, recognizing how my body has been the object of much that I would not prefer, of uninvited touching, of looking, of glaring, that I have felt unsafe and uncomfortable in situations because I'm a woman, in ways that men, they just don't have to deal with it. It doesn't happen for men. And it allows me to relate to the other animals that are oppressed and exploited because of their female biology, because they are born with wombs, because they are born with vaginas, because someone can shove their arm up the vagina of a cow, force her to be pregnant so that she will bear young, which they take away and eat, and then her milk can be taken from her. It's because of her biology that she's exploited. And when I did the math, I saw how much more the female animals suffer because they are female animals. So here, when I calculated, they suffer 7 times as long, the female cows that are repeatedly impregnated and used for reproduction, whether it's in the industry for beef or the industry for the dairy products. And the sows and hens, 12 times as long. So not only do they suffer longer, but the ways that they suffer are more painful. And the reason we don't notice this is because we don't notice it even with human beings. And if we can't even see how women are objectified and have to struggle to maintain the integrity of their own female biology and their own bodily integrity, how can we possibly start to see this for other species? We have to recognize the similarity. We have to recognize that as animals and as females, we share a biology, and we share that, as ecofeminists say, that exploitation of all that is on the not A side. And when we start to recognize that, we recognize that it isn't enough to be one issue. We have to struggle to break down this system of oppression, and we have to liberate all that is on the not A side. So that if we actually care about suffering, we can't just care about our own suffering or the suffering of those who look like us. We have to get on board to help stop the suffering of people of color, of the elderly, of those who are disabled, of the poor, of people in other countries, as well as all of the other species that we are exploiting. So feminists need to be vegans because they need to get that this is exploitation of female biology and it's not acceptable. And vegans need to be feminists because we have to recognize the connection between the exploitation of female biology and the exploitation of animals. And because as a group, we also have to be functional, and in the United States, we are becoming very dysfunctional because we have a dynamic where powerful young males are exploiting and harming the females in the group. And it's because we don't understand these connections. So this is where we've been, and I'm open to questions.
I was wondering, though, I just wanted to hear your comments. You said that some of the oppressions that we experience in a society, they are so normal that they become invisible to us. And I think yet there's a kind of even hierarchy if we think about different oppressions. I would say racism is much less tolerated than sexism, and maybe even what concerns the well-being of animals, it's even more, normalized, that they are objectified. So what are your views on making these different oppressions more visible? I know that today you wanted to kind of interlink them to make them more visible, but maybe there's other strategies.
First thing I want to say is I think we want to be really careful about talking about what's visible. I'm guessing that if I were a Latina, I would say that the racism is not less tolerated. And I know that in my country that it's gone underground is what it's done. So that, for example, if a Latina and I show up to rent an apartment, I'll get the apartment, right? So it's there and it's hard to see, but it's systemic in the sense that it's all over the place. So how to make it visible? Well, I'm an educator, right? So for me, get the word out. Maybe do things like this that make so we can't ignore it, so that we can start to see the connection. And I think too, so that we can recognize that this isn't someone else's problem. This is all of our problems, and it affects all of us. And as animal activists, we have very much a tendency to always say, they have it the worst, the pigs have it the worst, the pigs, the cows, the chickens, they have it the worst. Well, it's true. It's true that they are overtly slaughtered, but it's not helpful to our movement. And I know that when I first talked to feminists, I was a complete embarrassment. I went in there with all my pictures of all the suffering. And so all the feminists had gathered a woman's space where it was safe and they were going to talk about all the oppression they had to deal with. And then I came to say, you're all oppressing too. Of course they were angry at me. They wanted to throw me out. I could just feel them sizzling, right? So learning how to be sensitive in dealing with, so I think this is a very important part of our activism. We have to be on board with other oppressions. We have to be much more sensitive to the plight of others. And me especially, so as a Caucasian I've always had enough to eat, I've got a good education, I've had so much privilege, and recognizing that and knowing it, and never imposing on others. So in as much as we need to do this kind of activism and help our group to understand this, we also always need to be tolerant and patient of difference, that we don't know another person's path. For example, a common thing among a certain class of people, I will say, a group of people, women who are not liberated, it might be with men who demand meat. So if I were to push a woman not to do that, I could actually endanger her in her home. I could put her in a position of feeling embarrassed because she's with someone she's afraid of, right? So understanding our privilege is really important. So I think if I were going to say one thing that each of us can do, we need to, this journey that I've been through, making myself aware of my own privilege and the place I stand in has been really important to my understanding the bigger picture. So understanding the links and understanding where we stand in society are two things I would suggest.
How do we talk sensitively in those situations, like the example you gave, where a woman might feel particularly vulnerable if she was to do something radical like go vegan?
That's a wonderful question. And the reason I like it is I think about when I'm talking to someone who I recognize it is, when I see my position and recognize they're in a different position, one thing I like to say is, I'm talking to people who look like me and who are similar to myself in key ways. So when I'm not, for example, when there's a person of color who I now understand has a whole different set of struggles that she deals with simply because she's born with a little different shade of skin. So I'm an ally for her. I'm not there to tell her anything. I'm there to learn from her, to understand better her place in the world. So it shifts me to recognize that when I am doing activism, I really need to limit it to talking to people who are more or less like I am. And one of the problems, one of the big mistakes that activists in the United States have done, as I say, we tend to be very brassy and not as sensitive as we might be, is thinking we're going to march into other communities and be activism. And we go there to bring change for the animals. So we go into poor communities to advocate for animals. Can you hear that that's not going to work? Right? We need to recognize that they have a whole different set of struggles, and we need to be allies to them and make sure that they have what they need. Because they're not going to be interested in some privileged person coming in there and telling them that they need to do something different. So be an ally when you're with someone you think is more vulnerable than yourself. So what was the second part?
When we pick up our friends or family using language that we might find insensitive, do you have any kind of practical tips on how to kind of gently encourage them in the right direction?
Gentle is definitely the term, and as I say, I have certainly been down the path where I've said everything I shouldn't have. So it's a wonderful thing to reflect on and think about how to be gentle and sensitive. But I think just knowing that we want to be. And the other thing I would say is don't pick on your family. You know, you're stuck with each other, and that's good. And somewhere deep inside you're connected, and there's a lot of love. And so don't damage that by bringing your activism home all the time. Bring your love home. And it doesn't mean you can't be vegans and strong vegans, but don't victimize those who are closest to you. So I guess, and I had somebody ask me this in Luxembourg, and my main thing I just said is go home and tell them that you love them. Don't go home and tell them that you won't eat what they're eating. So remember that we are supposed to move from a place of compassion and love, and activism should always stem from that center. So I think that's the best I can do with that. It's a hard question.
Okay, now thank you so much, Lisa. Let's keep it.